Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first debate session of the Time Travelers Club. I'm Fanan Sheikh, the Vice President of the club, and your moderator for today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Said Santosh. I'm the president of the club, and I'll be grading and maintaining the mark sheets for today's debates.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Usman from class 12A. Today, I will be the rapporteur of this session, and I am the senior president of the club.
So, the motion before us is the atomic bombings of Japan. So, why this topic matters, right? So, in August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing an estimated 200,000 people, most of them civilians. World War II ended shortly after, but the debate continues. Many people think that the bombing saved lives by preventing a land invasion. Others argue they were morally indefensible, targeting civilians and introducing the world to nuclear terror. This is not just history, it's about how we decide what is acceptable in war then and now. So, since this topic involves real human suffering, survivors known as Hibakusha and families still affected today, the rules of this debate require that all speakers avoid mocking victims, trivializing suffering, or making personal attacks. Strong disagreement is welcome, disagreement is not. Now, I will call Usman Fuzail, the rapporteur for today, to state the rules of the debate.
So, the rules of the debate today are all debaters must be respectful. Attack must be directed at the argument, not at a person. No name calling, insult, or personal attacks are allowed. One person at a time. Only the speaker with the floor should be talking. No one else should. Point of order: to maintain decorum, students must raise their hand and wait to be recognized by the judges to ask a question. Rebuttals: only one rebuttal is allowed for each speaker. Except for captains, they are allowed two rebuttals. Follow the time limit. Each speaker is allotted 3 minutes, and no new arguments in rebuttals. The final rebuttal speech for summarizing and explaining why your team is against the speaker's idea should be the same. Introducing a brand new idea here is not allowed. Point of structure: plus 5 points for speech and plus 3 for rebuttal.
Alright, so let me announce the team members. Team 1, for the motion, the bombings were justified. The captain is Tazim, and the members are Luke, Maria, Shrenik, Agria, Hums, and Shabana. And for Team 2, against the motion, bombings were not justified. The captain is Sandeep, members are Beena, Jaden, Ayan, Akash, Ashaz, Archita, Ishan, and Nanita. So before we begin, I require that when you speak, please switch on your camera and then go ahead. Right. So let's begin. First, I am pleased to welcome Tazim, the captain of Team 4, to deliver the opening speech for the motion. Tazim, the floor is yours for 3 minutes.
Good morning, honorable judges, and fellow participants. Today, I'm here to argue that the atomic bombings of Japan were a necessary evil to acknowledge a grim utilitarian truth. The tragedy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki forestalled a far more expensive multi-generational catastrophe. Beyond the immediate preservation of lives, the use of these weapons was strategically vital for two reasons, rarely given due to weight in this debate. Firstly, we must consider the avoidance of fractious sovereignty. By August 1945, the Soviet Union had terminated its neutrality pact and was rapidly advancing through Manchuria. Had the war not concluded with the immediate shock of the atomic blast, Japan would likely have suffered the same fate as Germany and Korea before. Split into ideologically warring halves under Soviet and Allied occupation, the bombing secured a unified sovereign fracture for the Japanese state, preventing decades of Cold War proxy conflict on the archipelago. Secondly, the bombings dismantled a Ketsugo military cult. The Japanese High Command had indoctrinated the civilian population of Japan to embrace Gyosuke, or the shattering of the jewel, a mandate for 28 million civilians to commit mass suicide rather than surrender. Had Truman not chosen to surrender for the lesser of the two evils, he would have chosen a finite order to prevent an infinite one. By delivering a singular psychological ultimatum, the United States ended a global slaughter that was otherwise poised to consume the entire Pacific Rim. Therefore, we firmly uphold the motion.
Thank you, Tazan, for that powerful speech. Now, if anyone wants to ask a rebuttal, please raise your hands. As he's the captain, you will get two rebuttals, meaning two people can ask him rebuttals. All right. We have Akash Nair. You have 30 seconds.
Yes. So, what do you think makes Truman have the right to decide between two evils? So, even if he would have chosen, first of all, Japan was already about to surrender as Soviet Union had invaded Japan. So the atomic bombings cannot be justified by this. The atomic bombings were just pointless because even if they had not been bombed, Japan would have already surrendered. And also, Truman should not have had and he does not have the right to decide between who gets to live and who gets to die. So,
Uh, Thank you for the question, Akash Nair. It isn't that Japan didn't want to surrender. Japan followed a strict samurai code, which meant that they would rather die than to surrender. They would not show their backs to the enemies at any point of time, and so they would not have surrendered. It was a difficult choice for Truman, as he did not want to slaughter millions of Japanese civilians. But he had no other option, as the only other choice in that situation was a full-scale land invasion of Japan. This would have brought even more casualties on the American and the Japanese sides. There was estimated 2 million casualties on the Japanese side alone from the land invasion on the first few days. So if Truman had not gone through with the nuclear bombing, it would have involved the death of maybe millions of more civilians and millions of more soldiers, which have made the war about 100 times worse for both sides and fractured the spirit of humanity for both the sides.
All right. Thank you, Tazan. Next, we have Ayan Sheikh from Team Against. Please state your question.
I have a straightforward question. If this happened to your country, would you still call this necessary?
Uh, mm, Excuse me, Ayan, could you please elaborate on your question?
I'm telling, you're saying that killing innocents was the only final decision that you guys had, without any other steps, pressurizing the country, diplomacy, but you directly went for the most destructive option. I'm saying, would you still call this necessary if this happened to your country?
Thank you for the question, Ayan. The Japanese had strict samurai code, as I've mentioned before, which prevented them from showing their backs to enemies or surrendering. The nuclear bombing was the final option against Japan, as there had been a lot of peace talks between the US and Japanese, but Japan refused to cooperate in any of these peace talks. As a matter of fact, during there were peace talks between Japan and the US during the Pearl Harbor bombing. For the US itself, during the start of the war against Japan, they felt that they were betrayed, as they were planning to have a pact to stop the war. So, but towards the end of the war, the war had taken a grave toll on both of the countries, on both the civilian minds and on the minds of the soldiers. So, I would say that if this happened in my country, I would not be a fan of it. But this was one of the only options that Truman had in his hands during those times, which would have minimized the civilian casualties as well as the military ones.
All right. Thank you, Tazan, for that answer. That was a beautiful answer. Next up, we have Sandeep, captain of Team Against, to speak against the motion. Sandeep, you have 3 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Farhan. Good afternoon to all those present, and I'm the captain of the team against the motion of the justification of the atomic bombings of Japan. So, first, let me ask you a direct question, all of you. You're just sitting in your home, eating breakfast. Within seconds, all of us gets decimated. No time to even react. How is that justified? See, the atomic bombings of Japan is a very not very understood case, because Japan was already targeted by the US, Soviet Union, on the verge of collapse. So how do you justify bombing of the civilians and not even the generals? The ratio is almost negligible. 2000 soldiers died, almost 2000 soldiers died in the Pearl Harbor, and the ratio is like almost 100 of that times in civilians. And I would also like to point out that the US, one minute, the US also had just successfully tested this weapon in the New Mexico desert in July 1945, and they knew the range of this weapon and what it could be capable of, and they went ahead with it. Second, America's Secretary of the State at that time, James Bynes, explicitly stated that the bomb would make the Soviet Union, America's rival, more manageable after the war. So this really leads us to the question: was US trying to suppress Japan, or was it just trying to show off its atomic power to Soviet Union? This is a very important question we should address. As we know, and as pointed by my fellow member Akash Nair, Japan was already in the verge of collapse. So why? The war was already about to end. This was not necessary. Never. So I would like to close my speech by saying effective is not the same as justified. And we should never be so relieved that a war ended, and we should stop asking why it ended and why this way. Thank you. And we stand against this motion.
Thank you, Sandeep. A thoughtful and passionate speech from the opposing captain. You brought emotional weight and historical perspective. Team 4, who wants to give a rebuttal? Please raise your hand. All right, we have Luke.
Good morning, Sandeep. You say that Japan was on the verge of collapse. Matter of fact, according to history, Japan was not had such high egos, they were not willing to stand down. You say that it was not worth that many innocent lives. You say that the bombing was just to show off the power to Soviet Union. But in fact, there was an actual reason behind it. You see, Japan had somewhat of a plan, known as Ketsugo. This plan was where they would train the women and the children of the house to get together bamboo spears and fight for their country on land, on land, preparing for anything. If this went on and America invaded Japan, they would cause millions of casualties. So why don't you stop it at once? Let's shut it down. Only after the bomb, the Japan decided took a blow to their infantry and decided maybe they should step down. What are your thoughts on this?
That was a very good question by Luke. And I would like to start by saying that all of the women participated. Do we know that? And where did the humanity of the Americans go? Let's take your case. Okay? Let's say you're a country and you're training your women because, let's say, you want to win the war. But what about the humanity of the Americans? Do they not have any brains? This is a very straightforward question to you guys. Almost 800,000 people died. Civilians. Okay, they were not part of the war. Some of them were children. What do you say for that? Even they were trained.
Some of them were children, but Japan still insisted on having protection.
Luke, we may only
Japan
have one
still
rebuttal.
insisted.
Luke,
What?
only one rebuttal. You can't ask
Oh,
follow-up
my bad.
questions. Sorry. Next up we have Agriya.
If you do not agree that it was bombing that caused Japan to surrender, then which event led Japan surrender and end the war?
Okay, so my understanding is that you're saying if the bomb had not happened, they would have not surrendered. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay. See, the bombing was only a faster way of already ending a war that was already about to finish. Anyway, Japan, even though had their samurai code of conduct and they wanted to sacrifice themselves. They were almost cornered. Three big countries on their back. So they could have just waited another year, because trading lives for ending the war is not the same. Killing 800,000 is not the same as ending the war instantly. You could have waited for 1 year. They were already cornered. So why this? Why this act of mass destruction? That's my question.
Really a well done job, Sandeep. Thank you for all of your rebuttals. Now we are going to move up to the members of the teams as you're done with the captain's speeches. Next, from team 4, please welcome Luke. Luke, you have 3 minutes to give your speech.
Good morning, dear opposition and friends. Let's be real. Nobody here is saying that the bombing was good. It's a tragedy, it's an event. But in the middle of the most violent war in history, the United States didn't have the luxury of choosing between the lives of Japanese people or the morality of the United States. They had to choose between a catastrophe or a apocalypse. The opposition will talk about the lives lost in Hiroshima, and we mourn them. But we also must look at the lives saved. Military experts at the time looked at Operation Downfall, the planned land invasion of Japan, projected to at least 1 million American casualties and Japanese deaths. Why? Because the Japanese government had already mobilized their entire population, including the women and children, to fight to the death with bamboo spears under the Ketsugo plan. A land invasion wouldn't have been a battle, it would have been a massacre. The atomic bombing would have ended that in just 1 day. We can't also forget the lives that the Japanese killed. 10,000 per day across the whole of Asia. I'm talking about China, Korea, and even Thailand. Every day we waited or negotiated would be 1,000, 10,000 lives wasted. And we could have just finished that in 1 day. Critics say Japan was ready to surrender. Were they? The facts say otherwise. The big six officials of the Japanese government were not ready to back down. Their egos were so high it could fill a volcano. They refused to quit. It took the shock and awe of the bomb to at least step down a notch. It is easy to judge history from a comfortable chair 80 years later. But in 1945, the goal was simple: stop the killing and end the massacre, which we had one choice. So we did it. That's why I think it is justified. Because if we hadn't, the massacre could have longed to 1 million lives more. Thank you.
All right, from team against, Ashaz. Right, Ashaz. Okay.
You say, oh,
Please go ahead.
you say the bomb saved lives. Saved whose lives? American lives? Possibly. But what about Japanese lives? The invasion of Kyushu was scheduled for November 1945. By August, Japan was already starving, firebombed, and begging Moscow to mediate. The only question was the emperor's status, something the Allies granted anyway. So here's the question. How do you count lives saved when you ignore the 200,000 Japanese civilians incinerated in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? If the war would have ended within weeks anyway, without any bomb, then the only lives saved were the ones never lost in a phantom invasion that never happened. You can't claim to save lives by taking innocent ones first. So tell me, by what moral math does slaughtering two cities become saving lives when waiting one more week would have caused zero atomic casualties?
I would like to answer that question. Now, you say that the war would have finished in about 2 more weeks, and we wouldn't have to use the atomic bomb. But in actual theory, the Japanese were not ready to quit. They wanted to be the one and only. They couldn't stop. They wanted to be on top, whether it's their lives or even American lives. Their egos were so high that they wouldn't stop. So as I was saying, you said that the war could have ended. You had no supplies. You were cornered. But what actually happened? The government didn't know what they were doing. They were simply wasting lives away in war. The Americans, stopped it with one day. That's why I think it is justified. Thank you, Ashas.
Luke, your one rebuttal is over, but if you wish, you can ask for one or two more.
No, it's
Is
okay.
it fine?
Yeah.
You're fine? All right. So let's continue with a member from team against. Aditya, 3 minutes, you may begin now.
Yes, so I'll start. Good morning, dear opponents and my dear friends. Mm, so my name is Aditya, and today we're here to challenge the long-standing myth that the atomic bombing of Japan was a necessary evil. Well, it was not. So you see, it was a military failure and a moral catastrophe. We opposed the bombing on three grounds. It was unnecessary, it ignored alternatives, and it violated the laws of war. So first, the argument of military necessity is false. Proponents claim that the bomb saved a million lives by preventing a land invasion, but history tells us otherwise. By 1945, Japan's navy was destroyed, and their economy was collapsing. U.S. intelligence confirmed that Japan was already looking for a way to surrender. They were defeated. They just needed a way to save face. Dropping the bomb wasn't a necessity to end the war. It was an overkill against a dying enemy. And then, second, viable alternatives were deliberately ignored. The biggest factor in Japan's surrender wasn't the bomb, it was the Soviet Union. On August 8th, the Soviets invaded Manchuria. This destroyed Japan's hope for a negotiated peace through Moscow. Even the U.S. strategic bombing survey concluded that Japan would have likely surrendered by November 1945 without the atomic bombing or without an invasion. Then you had the option to wait, but you chose to incinerate instead. Then finally, morality. So war requires a distinction between soldiers and civilians. The atomic bomb obliterates that distinction. The bombs were the bombs did not target military installations; they targeted entire cities. The victims were overwhelmingly women, children, and elders. We cannot claim to fight for freedom while using weapons that commit indiscriminate mass murder. You do not need to become monsters to defeat a monster. The bombing of Japan was unnecessary, diplomatically avoidable, and morally wrong. As we know, that violence cannot erase violence. If the cost of ending a war is the loss of our humanity, then what have we truly won? Thank you.
Guys, just to remind you all, please don't raise your hand until the speech is over. When I say it's time for rebuttal, only then raise your hand. Um, Isam Qureshi, please give your rebuttal.
Aditya, like to ask you a question. You say Japan was trying to surrender through the Soviet Union in July. But if that's true, why did Japan's military reject the Potsdam Declaration just days later? And why, even after Hiroshima was dropped, did Japan's military still refuse to surrender for another 6 days? If they were genuinely ready to negotiate, wouldn't they have stopped fighting immediately after the first bomb?
Okay, Sam. So I'll say first of all, Japan was already looking for ways to surrender. It's not like they were not trying to surrender. They were looking for ways. Even the leader in Japan, he just couldn't accept it in front of his people because then they would think ill of him. And then second of all, Japan was weak, its navy was weak, its army, almost everything was demolished. Then they had nothing left. And there was no other choice but to surrender. So they were trying their best to surrender. But they just couldn't show it in the way so that the people wouldn't think bad of the leaders.
Can I ask a follow-up?
No, no, Isam. All right, Aditya, if you wish, you can get more rebuttals for extra points. Um,
Yeah.
all right, okay. Um, I guess Isam again. Isam?
Can I ask another rebuttal?
Yes, you may, Isam.
You claim that the bombs were not about saving lives, but if that's true, why did the US military planners estimate 500,000 to 1 million casualties for mainland invasions? These estimates came before the bomb was even ready. So, how can you say the bombs weren't about military necessity if it was just about politics? Why would planners bother calculating invasion casualties at all? And why did they even reject the Potsdam Declaration and surrender 6 days after the bombings, though they suffered so many casualties?
I'm sorry, Isam, could you repeat the question?
Let me make the question a bit shorter. If the claims were not about saving lives, then why is it that the US military planners estimate 500,000 to a million casualties for a mainland invasion? These estimates came way before the bomb was even ready. How can you say the bombs weren't about military necessity? If it was just about politics, why would planners bother calculating invasion casualties at all? And if Japan even surrendered, then why would it reject the Potsdam Declaration and surrender literally 6 days after the bombings?
Okay, so first of all, the US US estimated over 500,000 to 1 million casualties. Well, this was so because of the land in because they were planning to do a land invasion, but then they got of 500,000 to 1 million casualties. So yeah, in the land invasion, there were women, children, and elderly, which would have in which they would have also been injured and killed. So, and in the casualties, even more of American troops would have been killed, which would have caused a whole lot of mass murders than the land invasions. So instead, you chose to bomb this. You chose the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that too, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not even military installations. They were instead entire cities and towns, which were full of people, innocent people.
All right, Aditya, do you want one more rebuttal, one last rebuttal, or
Mm,
we can continue?
you can continue. I don't want to rebut it.
All right, okay. So next up, we have Arif from Team 4. Is there any Arif? Okay, so since we don't have Arif here with us, we will continue with another member from Team Against. Um, Jaden. Jaden, please go ahead.
Imagine a single weapon wiping out an entire city in seconds, leaving nothing but silence, destruction, and suffering. That is exactly what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. In this debate, I stand firmly against the use of atomic bombs on Japan. Over 200,000 people died. Most of them were innocent civilians. This was not just a military attack, it was a catastrophe. Japan was already weakened, especially after the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, and alternatives like negotiations were possible. The bombings also set off a dangerous chain of events. leading to nuclear tensions during the Cold War. No matter the circumstance, destroying entire cities and civilian lives can never be justified.
All right, any rebuttals for Jaden? Luke.
Okay, my question is, see, if we hadn't used the bomb, and the alternative was just a naval blockade to starve Japan into surrendering, how is it to starving millions of civilians to death over several months of more morale? What? Okay, let me shorten the question. What is better, starving millions of Japanese people or just ending this whole war in just a few days? Luke, can you just repeat the question in more explanation form? Okay. You say that Japan was already gonna surrender. It was cornered. That you guys were gonna starve to death if we hadn't bombed you. Now, my question is, how is starving millions of Japanese people for months together better than just ending the war in just a few days? See, starving for other people for this could maybe will do this, but Japan is telling to bomb the city, right? As you said. So, wait, can you just repeat the question one more time? I did not get you because I did not get. Last time, sorry. If we hadn't used the bomb, you say that Japan was already on its last legs. They were not going to survive much long. They were probably going to surrender in 2 weeks. If we hadn't used the bomb, you guys would be starving. Millions of lives will be starved to death. What is better? Japanese civilians starving to death or just ending this whole catastrophe in just a few days? I would prefer of Japan starving to that instead of ending the war. See, look, first of all, they can live. You're affecting millions and billions of children for their lives. See, children have lives, all right? They have a future ahead of them. And you are bombing the flipping country, which is not acceptable and ending their lives. How could you do this?
Jaden, would you like another rebuttal or should we go ahead?
Just go ahead.
All right. Okay. Next up, we have Maria from Team 4. Maria, please give your speech.
The atom bomb was no great decision. It was merely another powerful weapon in the arsenal of righteousness. A quote by President Harry S. Truman. A very good afternoon respect to everyone present here. I am Marilis Abraham and I stand for the atomic bombings in Japan. By August 1945, Japan did not surrender despite devastating losses. Operation Downfall was projected to cost hundreds of thousands of Allied lives and millions of Japanese lives. The atomic bombs made Emperor Hirohito announce Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, forcing an immediate surrender, ending the war in days rather than months or years. The bombs were not about choosing between life or death. It was about choosing between mass death and even greater mass death. Um, I would like to share a few points for I would like to share a few points for why the atomic bombs were necessary. The atomic bombs had reduced Japanese military and civilian casualties. It also forced an unconditional surrender, and it also demonstrated US power to the USSR. In 1945, there wasn't an international treaty that prohibited atomic weapons. The laws of war in 1945 was to target industrial cities, which was why Hiroshima and Nagasaki were targeted. Hiroshima housed military headquarters, while Nagasaki was a center of naval power and and it also had munitions factory. The shock of these atomic bombs resulted in long-term deterrence of nuclear war for the past 80 years, and no alternative had yet produced and no alternative had yet produced Japan's surrender this quickly. Therefore, the bombings, while tragic, were justified as the lesser of two evils. Thank you.
All right. Any rebuttals for Maria? Ayan Sheikh, please go ahead.
A very straightforward question. Are you defending a decision or just making yourself comfortable with its consequences?
Could you just repeat the question again and simplify it a bit?
I'm saying, are you trying to defend the decision or are you just making yourself comfortable with its consequences?
Moral arguments cannot ignore consequences. Let's just say that the atomic bombs did not happen. If the war continued, there would have been starvation from blockade, there would have been a continuation from firebombing, and a full-scale invasion. Sorry. These would have killed far more civilians over time. You mentioned nuclear precedent, but at that moment, leaders were not deciding about the future of nuclear ethics. They were deciding how to end a war immediately. And it worked. Japan surrendered within days. The war ended. Millions who would have died in prolonged conflict lived. Thank you.
Maria, do you want more rebuttals? Or
No thanks. You can continue.
okay. So next up we have Ayan from Team Against. Ayan, you have 3 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Imagine this. You're just a kid walking to school on a normal morning. The sun is out, your bag is on your shoulder, and you're thinking about your friends, your classes, maybe what you'll do after school. Life feels simple, safe. And then everything changes. In a single flash, your world is gone. This wasn't imagination. This was the reality for thousands of children in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. One moment, they were just like us, laughing, learning, and living. The next, their homes, their schools, their families vanished. No warning, no chance to run. Just a blinding light, and then silence. Those who survived were left in a world they did not recognize. Injured, scared, alone. Many lost their parents, many lost everything. And even after that day, the suffering didn't stop. It stayed with them for years, in ways no child should ever have to endure. So when people say this was necessary, we need to stop and think. Necessary for what? For ending a war? Or at the cost of countless innocent lives who had no part in it? Because at the end of the day, this is not just about history or decisions made by leaders. It's about that child walking to school, never knowing their life was about to end. Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not just events, they are reminders of how powerful and how destructive humanity can be. And it is our responsibility to make sure such a moment never happens again. Thank you.
All right. Any rebuttals for Ayan? Isam, please go ahead.
You are cherry picking the civilian death tolls and the death of children. Yes, 140,000 died at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But Japan's own firebombing campaigns killed hundreds of thousands of civilians in China. Japan's occupation of Philippines killed over 1 million people in Philippines. Other places where Japan had occupied in Asia were places in Nanjing and Unit 731 where millions of POWs were being killed every single day. The US didn't create the moral problem, Japan did by refusing to surrender even when defeated. The bombs ended Japan's ability to keep killing.
Would you please repeat the question and simplify it a bit?
Simplification just says that you are cherry picking civilian death tolls. If 140,000 died at Hiroshima and Nagasaki together, keep it at your right hand. At the left, you will see that Japan killed in its own firebombing campaigns 1 million Chinese civilians. In the areas of Nanjing in Unit 731, more than 2 million people were killed using biochemical weapons. 1 million people were killed in the Philippines, and in other Japanese territories in Asia, POWs were being killed every single day. My question is, you say the US created the moral problem. I say, do you agree that Japan did create the moral problem by refusing to surrender even when defeated? Even when defeated. The bombs ended Japan's ability to keep killing.
So you're saying that USA killed a lot of people in Japan. Yes, that's true. That USA killed a lot of people in Japan. It was necessary. But why? Why use such a strong weapon to create? This is not humanity. This is just a destructive weapon. This is not supposed to be your first decision. This is supposed to be your last resort. Even if you have killed a lot of people, it doesn't mean that you can destroy a whole country. Many people died, many innocents. They were living peaceful lives. They weren't even involved in the war. I agree that Japan killed a lot of people in China and other countries that you stated. But doesn't mean that USA also had to attack and kill a lot of innocent lives.
All right. Any more rebuttals, Ayan? Do you want any more rebuttals?
No, it's fine.
We'll go ahead. Next up from Team 4, we have Shrenik. Shrenik, you have 3 minutes.
Sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same. Good afternoon. My name is Shanik. I know that what I'm about to defend is controversial, even painful to hear. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are remembered as acts of devastation. Yet, I will argue that in the context of 1945, there were drastic measures taken to avoid an even worse catastrophe. If you ask, most people would say that World War II began in 1939. However, some would argue that it actually began back in 1931 when the Japanese army seized control over the Manchuria region of China. Later, Japan also attacked on places like Pearl Harbor and was a close ally to Germany and Italy. Even after Germany and Italy were defeated in 1943, and it was clear that Japan had lost the war, it still refused to surrender for 2 more years. They were driven by the Bushido Code, which glorified death over surrender. It was estimated that a mainland invasion by the Allied forces would cost millions of lives on both sides. Faced with this grim reality, the United States chose the nuclear option as the lesser of two evils, a decision that forced Japan's surrender and ended a war that had already claimed tens of millions of lives worldwide. Most importantly, the bombing saved more lives than they took. Around 200,000 people died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but that is much less than the millions who would have died in case of long war by Allied forces on Japanese land. When we consider that Japan carried out brutal actions across Asia and showed no willingness to end the war, even as defeat became inevitable, the bombings were seen not only as military necessity but as the only way to bring peace quickly and decisively. I would like to end by saying, do not judge a decision by its difficulty, but the necessity that demanded it. Thank you.
All right. Nanita, please go ahead.
You talk about Pearl Harbor and some other things that Japan has done.
So let's talk about Pearl Harbor. How does an attack on military forces justify the mass killing of civilians later?
Could you repeat, please?
Uh, you talked about Pearl Harbor and how, yes, it is in fact a very tragic event, but not as tragic on what happened on Hiroshima. How does an attack on millions later?
Japan not only attacked military bases but killed millions of people worldwide. Thank you. Thank you.
Shrenik, would you like any more rebuttals?
No,
Or
thank you. You can continue.
all right, okay. Okay. Next up, we have Akash from Team Against. Akash, you have 3 minutes.
Respected judges and my dear friends, let me begin with a story. Sadako Sasaki was just 2 years old when the bomb fell on Hiroshima. She survived that day, but 10 years later, she died of leukemia caused by radiation, folding paper cranes, just hoping to live. She didn't die in the explosion, but she died because of it. In August 1945, over 70,000 people died instantly in Hiroshima and 40,000 in Nagasaki. By the end of the year, the number crossed 200,000, most of them innocent civilians. Children, families, and entire cities gone in one flash. And we call this victory? Some say it ended the war quickly, but at what cost? Let us not forget, this war began for the United States on the attack on Pearl Harbor, where around 2,400 lives were lost. But what followed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not equal retaliation, it was destruction on an unimaginable scale. From 2,400 lives to over 200,000 lives lost, from a military base to entire civilian cities, and from an attack to annihilation. This was not justice, this was escalation. And I would like to highlight a few important points. Japan was already on the verge of surrender. Its cities destroyed, its economy collapsed, and its people starving. The bomb was not the only option, it was the most extreme one. Even in war, there must be limits. Targeting civilians on such a massive scale is not strategy, it's a violation of humanity. You don't save lives by destroying hundreds and thousands of them. The bomb did not just kill people, it erased communities, cultures, and generations in just seconds. Survivors lived on with burns, cancers, and lifelong trauma. This wasn't just destruction, it was generations of suffering. Nearly half of Hiroshima's doctors were killed, leaving thousands injured without medical care. Many survivors were socially isolated and discriminated against, adding emotional pain to physical suffering. Cities like Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just military targets, they were homes filled with innocent lives. And as J. Robert Oppenheimer said, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Even the man who created the bomb could not escape its bare truth. Ladies and gentlemen, just because we can create something does not mean we should use this. Science should build life, not destroy it. The atomic bombings were not just a military decision, they were a moral failure of humanity. So I ask you, is victory worth the price of innocent lives? Is peace worth the cost of generations of suffering? History has already answered, and it is our responsibility to ensure that it is never repeated. Thank you.
Brilliant speech, Akash. Any rebuttals for Akash? Only Sam. Okay. Sam, please go ahead.
Verging on surrender is not the same as surrendering. If it was, then why did Japan reject the Potsdam Declaration July 26? Still fighting after Hiroshima August 6, still fighting after Nagasaki August 9, and only surrendered after August 15 when the emperor overruled. And also, I would like to add that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not civilian cities, they were military cities, not random targets. Hiroshima was a Japanese Army's second army headquarters, and Nagasaki was a major military port producing war materials.
Okay, so in response about the Potsdam Declaration, actually in 1945, Japan rejected the Potsdam Declaration because it wanted to maintain its imperialism. It did not want to just absolutely surrender without any condition. So to maintain its imperialism, it just wanted to stay free. So it did not want to get divided like Germany into East Japan and West Japan. It wanted to stay as one. So it did not surrender immediately. It wanted to fight until the end. And also, they were military cities, but 95% of the lives lost were civilians, not military, of both cities actually. So 200,000 died, and you might say that a million would die if the war continued. But actually, the war could have stopped if they didn't even put the atomic bombs. Japan was actually on the verge of surrender. So if they waited just for one more week, Hirohito would have surrendered. So that's my response.
Any more rebuttals, Akash, or should we continue? Can continue? All right, fine. Next rebuttal from Luke. Luke, go ahead.
Give me a second. Okay. My question is, every day, if the war continued, thousands of people were dying in Japanese occupied territories like China and Korea. By prolonging this war to avoid using the bomb, how many thousands of Korean or Chinese lives would have been lost just because you wanted control?
Okay, so a war is a fight between soldiers. It's not a fight between civilian against civilian. Civilians don't die, soldiers do while fighting. And soldiers are willing to give up their lives, not civilians who can actually have, even children died actually. And children who could have grown up to become great men and women. So, how do you justify this? I like 95% of civilian life died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And yeah, that's what I'm saying. So even if the war prolonged, only soldiers would have died, not civilians. Well, even if civilian life would have died, not so many civilians. 200,000 civilian lives. Can you imagine that? Not military, civilians. Normal civilians.
Well, Akash, you can have one more rebuttal if you wish to do so.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Oh, all right. Okay. Any more rebuttals? Okay, Luke. All right, sure. Go ahead, Luke.
Okay. My second question is, in previous battles, Japanese civilians were forced by their own military to commit suicide rather than surrender. Knowing this, how can you claim a land invasion wouldn't have resulted in a total civilian massacre?
Okay. So civilian massacre would have occurred. But I'm not saying that putting an atomic bomb and killing thousands instantly can be justified. Now, in previous battles, yes, Japanese civilians were forced to do, which was called kamikaze, but they were brainwashed by their emperor. They were not willingly doing this, but they were actually forced to do this. So I'm not saying that they actually joined the army and they wanted to do this now. And they were also asked by their emperor to do this. So actually they were asked to. And they wanted to do it. Actually, many kamikaze pilots were actually willingly going and sacrificing their lives for their country. So yes, that is my
Akash, if you wish, the moderator too can give you a rebuttal, as all three rebuttals from the members have gotten over, or would you like to continue?
yes, actually you can continue.
Continue. All right. Okay. So next up we have Agriya from Team 4. Agriya, you have 3 minutes.
Judges, respected opponents. Today, I stand in support of the motion that the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, while undeniably tragic, were justified in the context of ending the Second World War. We must first understand the situation in August 1945. The war in the Pacific was not nearing a peaceful resolution through negotiation. It was a collapsing battlefield where Japan had not yet agreed to unconditional surrender despite severe losses. Conventional warfare had already devastated cities across Japan, and yet the conflict continued. The world was not facing a clean end to war but the risk of prolonged destruction. The decision to use atomic weapons was not taken lightly. It was made in a context where an invasion of Japan, was being seriously prepared. Military estimates at the time predicted extremely high casualties on both sides. Hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers and potentially millions of Japanese civilians and military personnel could have died in such an invasion. Compared to this scenario, the bombings, as horrific as they were, brought an immediate end to large scale combat. Secondly, the bombings achieved what months of conventional warfare and blockades could not, a decisive surrender. Japan's leadership, influenced by military ideology and internal divisions, was not responding to prior warnings or destruction. The atomic bomb created a reality that could not be ignored, forcing a conclusion to a war that had already consumed millions of lives globally. We must also view this through the lens of total war. In World War II, civilian and military spheres were deeply intertwined, and entire societies were mobilized for war efforts. The bombings must be understood within this harsh global context where every major power was engaged in large scale strategic destruction. Ultimately, the justification rests not on ignoring human suffering, but on weighing catastrophic alternatives. The atomic bombings ended the war swiftly, prevented an even greater loss of life, and reshaped the course of global conflict. Thank you.
All right. Aditya, please give your report.
Thank you. Okay, so you said that you had no other option, and so I would like to ask you: are you defending the bombing as a moral necessity, or are you like justify? Are you going to justify it after the fact that it is truly a necessity? Or why can't you prove that there was no other option that would have worked? Yeah.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, you said that there was no other option. So, are you defending the bombing as a moral necessity, or are you justifying it after the fact that it is truly a necessity? Or why can't you prove that there was no other option should have worked?
There was no another alternative. As I said, if land invasions had been prepared, it would cause more casualties than what bombing had already done. And other alternatives could have caused Japanese civilians to die of starvation. So yeah, was a better and immediate death and a loss of a prolonged conflict that could have caused global problems.
Agriya, would you like one more rebuttal, or would you just like to be
We can
continue?
continue.
Continue. All right. Okay. Next up, we have Ashaz from Team Against. Ashaz, please go ahead.
Yeah. So can I want to tell you about a man I never met. His name was Kenji. He was a teacher in Hiroshima. On the morning of August 6th, he finished his breakfast, stepped onto his wooden porch to tie his sandals, and looked up. He saw a silvery dot. Then a light so absolute that the sun itself seemed to fall on him. When he woke, he was crawling through a river of ash. His eardrums had melted. People passed him with skin hanging from their arms like wet sleeves. He reached for a child crying for her mother, only to realize the child's eyes had turned to liquid. Kenji survived, but he never heard his wife's laugh again. He spent 32 years waking up in a cold sweat, haunted by human shadows burnt permanently into granite steps. And we're asked to believe that Kenji's vaporization was necessary. The other side will say, we saved lives, we ended the war, but a mercy that requires incinerating 140,000? Kenji's in Hiroshima and 74,000 in Nagasaki is not mercy. It is arithmetic dressed up as morality. By August 1945, Japan was already defeated. The navy was at the bottom of the ocean. The emperor was seeking a negotiated surrender. The only sticking point? Keeping the throne. We did not give them time. We did not want the cities. We dropped a weapon of utter destruction on a city of schools, hospitals, and wooden porches. Why? To intimidate the Soviet Union. The Japanese were just the canvas. Let me tell you another story. A young girl named Sadako Sasaki developed leukemia from the radiation. She tried to fold 1,000 paper cranes, believing it would heal her. She died at 12, still clutching crane number 644. Those cranes are the answer to this debate. Each fold represents a lie, we tell ourselves. It was quick, it saved lives. What saved lives was the eventual surrender. We could have demonstrated the bomb on an uninhabited island, or we could have tightened the blockade. We chose the bomb not because we had to, but because we could. A civilization is not measured by how it wins wars, it is measured by what it refuses to do to win. I do not stand here to condemn America. I stand here to say we are better than this argument. We can honor our soldiers and mourn the Japanese children. We can celebrate the victory and weep for the method. Reject the motion, not for the past alone, but for the next Kenji, the next child with a paper crane, the next person who looks to the sky and prays the light never turns solid, because some shadows should never be burnt into stone. Thank you.
Amazing visual imagery in your speech, Ashas. Um, any rebuttals? All right, Agria, please go ahead.
Yes, so long term suffering is tragic, but we must compare it to prolonged wartime suffering, starvation, firebombing, and continuous conflict, which would have affected far more people over a longer period.
I'm sorry, can you just repeat your question? I had some.
You're saying that that it caused long-term radiation suffering. But suppose the bombing was never done. Then also it would have caused prolonged wartime suffering, starvation, firebombing, and continuous conflicts, which would have affected far more people over a longer period.
Okay, thank you for your question. That comparison is misleading because it assumes the only way to end suffering was through atomic destruction. Yeah, long time wartime suffering is tragic, but starvation, firebombing, and prolonged conflict are all horrific. But the key issue is not whether suffering existed, it's about how we chose to respond to it. You cannot justify one form of extreme suffering by replacing it with another, even more immediate and concentrated form of mass civilian death. The atomic bomb did not eliminate suffering in a neutral way, it intensified and concentrated it onto specific civilian populations in a single moment, followed by long term radiation effects. So I agree that wartime suffering was catastrophic, but that does not automatically make the atomic bomb morally justified. Ending suffering faster does not make the method morally acceptable if it introduces an entirely new scale and type of human.
Ashas, would you like more rebuttals or should we continue?
Yeah, sure. I'll take more of it.
All right. Luke, please go ahead.
Okay. You say that Japan was on the verge of surrendering. I say they were not. Let's forget that. Let me ask you the same question. What you're for? Example, you had the opportunity to bomb US. Example, we were doing the wrong. We had captured many capitals around us. We had massacred everywhere, and we were not willing to surrender. If you had the opportunity to use a bomb, would you use it? Or what do you think you could have used to defuse the situation?
Okay, thank you, Luke, for your question. I understand the point you're making, but the claim that Japan was not on the verge of surrender is not as clear cut as you're saying it. By mid 1945, Japan's military capacity was severely degraded. Its navy was largely destroyed, its cities were under continuous firebombing, and it was facing total blockade. There were also internal discussions and diplomatic signals indicating a willingness to negotiate terms, especially around like, preserving the emperor system. So while it may not have been an immediate unconditional surrender, it was certainly not a position of strategic strength or communication. Now, regarding your analogy suggesting what if we had the opportunity to bomb the US? That comparison doesn't hold. Debates about wartime decisions must be based on historical context, military necessity, and available alternatives at that time, not hypothetical scenarios removed from reality. Ethical like justification cannot be built on extreme what ifs that ignore actual conditions on the ground. So the real issue is not whether Japan was or wasn't ready to surrender, but whether mass civilian annihilation was the only or necessary way to end the war. And that is exactly what remains highly disputed.
Ashaz, would you like one more rebuttal? Should we go ahead?
Yeah, sure. I'll take one more rebuttal.
One more rebuttal. No rebuttals? All right. Since there are no rebuttals, we'll go ahead. Next up on the speakers list is Hums from Team 4. Hums, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, respected panel of judges and my dear friends. So, we speak today of a world that had forgotten how to bleed because it was drowning in blood for like 6 long years. In the From Pearl Harbor to the firebombing of Tokyo, every act of justice was just a seed, the next act of revenge. We call this total war in the war language, right? But it's nothing but a spiral or a loop where both sides believe that they are the hero of their story, and neither side knows how to stop until everyone is dead. Now, the motion before us argues that the atomic bombings were not a military choice. They were the only way to break the loop before it consumed the soul of humanity. People might say that this is the low honor decision, right? The quick, more easy decision. But think of the people who actually made the decision, like President Harry Truman and the Allied leaders who faced the burden. They chose to carry the weight of being the villain in history to ensure that millions of soldiers and civilians on both sides didn't have to die in mainland invasion. They traded their moral purity for a tomorrow that actually existed. Now, if we look at 1945 as a clean slate, it doesn't justify a lot of things. Now, I would like to bring the comparison of the 1945 to something like the Wild West, right? At the frontier of the old America that was dying due to the age of outlaws and gunslingers, right? Now, if we compare it to 1945, it was full of people and leaders who were more satisfied and more into what they wanted to do as per they were more materialistic, right? That it never occurred the betterment of the posterity or the people who were coming after the collapse of the entire world. It was a cold, unfeeling arrival of modernity. It told the world that the era of glorious last stands and honorable cavalry charges is over. The geopolitical reality was that a new, colder struggle was beginning. The bombings were a warning shot to the future, a terrifying display that forced a pause. It replaced the hot, chaotic violence of the frontier with a nuclear taboo. It was a brutal peace, a cynical peace, but it was a peace that lasted only 8 years. Thank you.
All right. Ayan, please ask your rebuttal.
You say that President Truman had a very hard decision to make. Let me ask you a question. Does having a difficult decision excuse the consequences of that decision?
Right, that's a wonderful question and really begs a lot of thinking. Now, talking about the weight of the decision, right? We all talked about how the amount of people that died in this war. The civilian casualties, right? It was in the thousands and thousands. We find the death of 200,000 people to be an unforgettable sin. That's right. But how do we characterize the decision to allow 10 million people to die in a protracted invasion? At what point does our moral purity become a death sentence for the innocent? That is the exact decision that people like Truman were going through. And that is why the decision like this carries so much weight. Yeah.
Hums, would you like another reporter?
No, that's all.
All right then. Let's move ahead. We have Archita from Team Against next. Archita?
Yeah, I'm audible, right?
Yes, please continue.
So, good afternoon, respected judges, honorable opponents, and everyone present here. Today, I stand firmly against the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, the world witnessed not just the end of a war, but the beginning of a new kind of horror. In a matter of seconds, entire cities was reduced to ashes. Over 2 lakh people lost their lives, most of them innocent civilians. Children going to school, families at home, ordinary people. None of them were soldiers, yet all of them had to pay the price. Supporters of the bombings often argue that it ended the war quickly and saved lives. But at what cost? Can we justify killing hundreds of thousands of innocent people in the name of saving others? If that logic is accepted, then where do we draw the line between war and inhumanity? Moreover, Japan was already weakened and on the verge of surrender. Its economy was collapsing, its military strength were fading, and diplomatic efforts were underway. The use of atomic bombs were not the only option, it was a choice and a devastating one. But the tragedy did not end in 1945. Survivors suffered for years due to radiation, many developed serious illnesses, and children were born with health complications. The pain continued across generations. This was not just a moment of destruction, it was a lifetime of suffering. We must also consider the dangerous precedent it set. The use of nuclear weapons opened the door to an arms race that still threatens humanity today. One decision in 1945 placed the entire world under the shadow of nuclear fear, a fear that has not disappeared even now. War is brutal, yes, but even in war, there must be limits. Humanity must not be sacrificed in the name of victory. The atomic bombings crossed that line also. In conclusion, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not acts of necessity, but acts that caused immense and unjustifiable human suffering. History should remember them not as a solution but as a warning, because true victory should never come at the cost of humanity itself. Thank you.
All right. Maria, please go ahead.
Okay, so you're arguing that Japan was close to surrender, but evidence shows otherwise. Even after Hiroshima, Japan did not immediately surrender. It took both bombs and the entry of the Soviet Union into the war to force a decision. Additionally, the idea of a demonstration ignores reality. What if it failed? What if Japan still refused? Meanwhile, conventional bombing, like Tokyo firebombing, had already killed more people than either atomic bomb, yet did not end the war. So the real question is, why would less shocking methods suddenly succeed when they already failed?
Do you mind repeating the question in a simpler manner?
Do you want to simplify it or? Okay, so my question is, you said that the atomic bombs were just a choice, but they were already they you said sorry you said that atomic bombs were just a choice. So my question is, if other methods had already failed, why would they suddenly work now?
Okay. Your point actually shows why the bombs worked in combination with other pressures, not why they were necessary or unnecessary. Japan didn't surrender after Hiroshima alone because its leadership were divided and still hoping to negotiate through the USSR. But once that Soviet Union entered the war and the second bomb hit Nagasaki, that last diplomatic and military strategy collapsed, forcing a decision. The firebombing of Tokyo was devastating, but it didn't carry the same psychological impact of a new weapon that signaled total future annihilation if the war continued. The atomic bombs changed the expected future cost, not just the present damage. So the question isn't why it suddenly worked, but why a combination of military collapse, Soviet entry, and unprecedented weapon shock finally removed every remaining option.
Rachita, would you like another rebuttal or should we continue?
No, you may continue.
All right. Okay. Next up, we have Isam from Team 4. Isam.
Good afternoon, honorable judges, teachers, and fellow students. On the 6th of August 1945, a single bomb was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second fell on Nagasaki. Shortly after, Japan surrendered, and the most destructive war in human history finally came to an end. I am here today to argue that those bombings, as devastating as they were the right call, not because the deaths didn't matter, they did, but because the alternative was far, far worse. By 1945, the Allied forces had been fighting Japan for years. Japan had been blockaded, its cities were being firebombed, its navy was destroyed, and still their military refused to surrender. Their code of honor treated giving up as a disgrace worse than death. American military planners were not being dramatic when they drew up Operation Downfall, a full ground invasion of Japan. Their own estimates put Allied casualties at over 250,000 Japanese casualties. Military and civilians were projected to reach into the millions. The atomic bomb made that invasion unnecessary. Two cities, two bombs in Japan surrendered. Now, people will say the bombs targeted civilians. That's true, but let's be honest about what the war already looked like. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed around 100,000 to 120,000 people in one single night. The distinction between military and civilian targets had already collapsed long before Hiroshima. What made the atomic bombs different wasn't their cruelty, it was their result. They ended it. And here's what people often overlook. Even after Hiroshima, Japan's War Council was still debating whether to continue fighting. It took the second bomb on Nagasaki and the Soviet Union entered the war before Emperor Hirohito finally overruled his generals and announced surrender. That tells you everything about how this war would have gone without those bombs. The bombs also changed the world in a way that still matters. The horror of what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki became the single strongest argument for international cooperation, arms control, and the United Nations. We have not seen another world war in over 75 years. This is not a coincidence. I am not standing here saying the bombings were a good thing. They were terrible. But in a war where every option costs life, waiting is never the option. They were the option that caused the fewest and ended the most suffering the fastest. Thank you.
Right, Isam. Um, Sandeep, please ask your rebuttal.
Yes. So, Isam, in your speech, and you would like to say
Sandeep,
that the
sorry to interrupt. Please switch on your camera.
consequences were far worse. But I would like to address the issue that when you say the consequences were far worse, you mean the lives, right? And of course, with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was not only the lives at that point, but also the radiation which caused millions of lives. And this sustains for long times of period. So US knew what it was doing. And how would you justify this? Would you just say this ended the war suddenly and this was an example to show? Because the US was already on the verge of collapse and US knew this. And even if you say they didn't stop, the leadership in Japan was dissegmented. So if some were already on the verge of talking in USSR about surrendering. So why was this necessary? And even though they knew the consequences, how can you justify this?
What I say might sound controversial. Yes, radiation caused terrible suffering, burns, and sickness, cancer. That's documented, but consider the alternatives. An invasion would have caused radiation too. The US planned to use tactical nuclear weapons during the invasion of Japan. Soldiers and civilians would have been exposed to radiation anyway. Plus, all the conventional weapons, napalm, and chemical weapons were about to be used if the bomb was not dropped. So, radiation exposure wasn't caused by the bombs, it was always going to happen. And the immediate suffering versus long term suffering is what I would like to speak about, which was a component of your question. 140,000 died immediately from the bombs, thousands more died from radiation in the following years. But an invasion would have killed millions immediately. You are comparing years of radiation sickness to instant death of millions, which is worse morally. Japan caused the situation for themselves. They refused to surrender, and Japan itself knew surrender meant accepting consequences. Japan chose to keep fighting even when defeat was certain. Japan made the choice that led to radiation exposure, not the US. And one more point that I would like to add, that radiation effects were unknown at the time. In August 1945, the full effects for radiation were not known. Decision makers wouldn't have predicted decades of cancer. They made the decision based on what they knew. End the war quickly. You can't judge the 1945 decisions by 2026 knowledge.
All right,
Can I just
Sam.
compliment? I'm not asking a question. Can I just compliment the knowledge on that personal one? For the scientists who knew how to make atomic bombs, I don't think it would be not necessary for them how to know the consequences of radiation. Not everything is public. Thank you.
All right. Sam, would you like more rebuttals or should we just go ahead?
Yes, I'd like more rebuttals.
Ishan Sen, please ask your rebuttal.
You said that the Japanese had surrendered. They were not surrendering. You said that the Japanese were not surrendering. They But I'm saying that the Japanese were on the verge of surrendering because uh, they only wanted their imperial the emperor to stay on the throne, and the US was not agreeing to that. That which is why the Japanese did not surrender. So what do you have to say for that?
In the rebuttals that I have asked to previous competence, I have mentioned this point again and again. On the verge is not the same as actually surrendering. You need to understand the difference between the two phrases. On the verge is not the same and never the same as actually surrendering. Show me the evidence Japan was about to surrender. July 26, Japan rejected Potsdam Declaration. August 6, Hiroshima bombed. Japan's response, silence. Military still wanted to keep fighting. August 8, Soviet Union declares war. Japan's response, still fighting. August 15, finally surrenders, but only because the emperor overruled the military. If Japan was on the verge, its wits entered, it didn't have the capacity to surrender. The military had to be forced by the emperor after two atomic bombs. That's not on the verge, that's stubborn refusal.
Sam, do you want another rebuttal?
Yes.
Aditya?
Thank you very much. So now I'll ask you some. If the bombing was justified because it ended the war quickly, does that mean any action, no matter how immoral, is accepted as long as it has a fast result?
Some matters of historical significance cannot be judged purely by how moral they were, because morality shifts perspectives on depending what you are viewing. Here we are viewing something that has been going on for that. Here you are using the logical fallacy of morality. But this argument or debate cannot be seen purely through the view of morals. Morals are not the way you are trying to portray them. Japan was not not surrendering, and morally or immorally, this might not have been the best thing to do. But logically and geopolitically, I say this was the best thing anyone could have done.
All right. Now we'll move ahead since all the rebuttals are over. Um, Next up, we have Ishan from Team Against. Ishan, please go ahead.
Yes. Okay, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to I'm stand firmly against the thing that against the motion that the atomic bombings were justified. These attacks were not a necessary evil; they were a moral failure and a tragic mistake. By mid 1945, Japan was already defeated. Its navy was destroyed, and its cities were being firebombed. The Japanese government was secretly trying to surrender, asking only that their emperor remains on the throne, a condition that the United States accepted later after the bomb. The Soviet Union's upcoming invasion of Manchuria would have delivered the final blow. Dropping the nuclear weapons was not the only option. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on two densely populated cities. They were military cities, but they were also hundreds and thousands of civilians living there. And 95% of the people that have died were civilians, in fact, and not military officers or generals. These were not military targets, they were acts of terror against innocent people. Even Admiral William Leahy, the President Truman's chief of staff, later said that the use of these barbarous weapons was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated. Alternatives existed. A demonstration of the bomb power on an empty area, combined with the conventional pressure of the Soviet entry, would have ended the conflict without the mass slaughter. Many Manhattan Project scientists also urged against the use of bombs. The bombings were not necessary to save lives. They took far more lives than they supposedly saved. They set a dangerous precedent that it is acceptable to use weapons of mass destruction on civilians. The atomic bombings were not justified then, and they're not justified today. Thank you.
Any rebuttals for Ishan? Agriya, please go ahead.
Yes. So, Ishan, you say that should leaders prioritize immediate moral ideals or minimizing total loss of life?
Sorry, what?
Should leaders prioritize immediate moral ideals or minimizing total loss of life?
See what the leaders actually did. Okay, they had a choice between demonstrating the bomb and actually putting the bomb on the main cities. They could have put it on a less populated city, and it didn't need, and it could have shown the destruction instead of killing 200,000 people.
All right, Ishan, would you like another rebuttal or should we go ahead?
You can continue.
Okay. Since there is all the members from Team 4 are done with their speeches, we'll be going ahead with Nanita from Team Against again. So, Nanita, please go ahead.
Yes. Good day to everyone. There are moments in history that forces us to decide not what is effective, but what is acceptable. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima is one of those moments, and I stand here to say it can never be justified. In a single instant, an entire city was destroyed. Tens of thousands of civilians, children, families, and ordinary people were killed, not because of who they were, but because of where they were. This was not a precise military solution, it was the use of a weapon that does not distinguish between soldier and civilian. Supporters argued it ended a war and saved life. But even if it did, we must ask, does ending a war justify any means? If we accept that, then there is no limit in conflict, no action too extreme, no suffering too great. By 1945, Japan was already weakened. Its resources depleted and its position increasingly hopeless. Alternatives existed, including negotiations and demonstrating the bomb's power without taking civilians' lives. Instead, nuclear weapons were introduced through mass destruction. Some points to desperate tactics like kamikaze missions, but desperate does not justify destructions. One extreme cannot excuse another, and the consequences did not end in 1945. Hiroshima changed the world. It made nuclear weapons a reality in warfare. Today, nations still threaten their use, and modern conflicts are shaped by the fear of nuclear escalation. Entire populations live under the shadow of weapons capable of destroying cities in seconds. Hiroshima was not just the end of a war, it was the beginning of a lasting global fear. The question was whether it was effective. It's not whether if it was effective. The question is whether we are willing to accept such an act. And the answer must be no. Because once we justify the destruction of innocent lives on that scale, we can justify anything. Thank you.
Right, any rebuttals? Hmm. Luke, please go ahead.
Okay, my question is, see, Japan did not rightfully surrender after the first bomb hit Hiroshima. One atomic bomb wasn't enough to make them quit. What makes you think a warning or negotiations would work?
You say that all because Japan did not want to surrender. You may say that, but even though the bomb was never the answer to destroying hundreds of lives. Yes, you might say that even if one bomb couldn't work, negotiations, anything could have saved it. They haven't tried. They just went for nuclear devastation. Thank you.
Would you want another rebuttal, Anita?
No, thank you.
Okay. So that concludes everyone's speeches. Thank you to every speaker. You handled a very heavy topic with intelligence and respect. Special thanks to Tazim and Sandeep for leading their teams. Now the judges will calculate the final scores. The winners will be announced shortly. So please stay put for 3 to 4 minutes. All right, the results have came in. Now Usman, the rapporteur, is gonna announce the winners. Usman.
Yes. So, guys, here are the results. Congratulations to the winning team. The team against the motion has won, and the best speaker for the motion is Luke. The best rebutter for the motion is Isam, and the best speaker against the motion is Akash, and the best rebutter against the motion is again Akash.